Hey guys, my name is Mike Loria, and this talk is entitled Simulation in EMS, where I discuss why I think EMS simulation is actually really important for providers of all levels. By way of background, I started out my career in EMS doing fire EMS in college, and then actually when I graduated from college, I went into the Air Force and I was a PJ or a pararescueman on active duty for about 6 years. I got out and I continued doing EMS, but this time doing critical care transport. I moved up to New Hampshire and started working for the amazing DART team out of Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center. And from there, really found my passion in medicine and decided to go back to school since I'm a glutton for punishment. So I went back to Dartmouth Medical School, or the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, graduated, and then decided to come out here because of the amazing emergency medicine, pre-hospital care, and also critical care. So I've been learning from the amazing EMS faculty as well as the faculty inside the hospital and trying to stay involved in EMS projects both through the consortium and through the lifeguard flight program. So let's get right down to it. Why simulation is important. Especially when I got out of the military, I really felt that flying around, or at least pretending to fly around with this plastic mannequin that blinked its eyes and made all sorts of funny sounds, was really not helpful. But the more I thought about it and reflected on my experience in sort of very high stress situations in the military and then flying at DART, what I realized was I wasn't really getting the most out of the simulation. And when I really started to think about it and focus on it and really invest myself in it, I started to get a ton out of it. A ton out of it. And we recently started some simulation work with Lifeguard and have having a great time. It's a little bit of a pause right now because of all this COVID stuff, but we're hoping to get back to it pretty soon. And I've already seen some significant improvements and gotten some great feedback from these guys, these amazing men and women on this team. So why simulation training? Okay. Simulation training is important for a number of reasons, but really the crux of it, the most important underlying concept to understand, is that learning information and being able to perform information or apply that information in the field are fundamentally different, right? Anybody in EMS knows that it's one thing to be able to regurgitate some facts and information or the protocol. It's another thing to be able to do it when it counts. And that's largely because of stress and the way it affects our brain. So when we get stressed out, we actually have chemical and electrophysiological effects in our brain that result in a number of changes to how we think and act. For example, our cognitive bandwidth, the bandwidth with which we can process information, pull it out of our memory, and apply it, is significantly decreased. People tend to get tunnel vision. They get fixated on things and forget about the big picture from time to time. Normally, if I gave you a simple triage problem like, hey, this person's got a broken leg, compound open fracture, and this person's having trouble breathing, which patient do you treat first? Well, the reason we harp on this stuff is because actually when people get stressed out, their brain's ability to triage that information and remember what's most important and not get fixated is actually compromised. Also, when you're stressed out, it's really easy to get distracted and it's hard to pay attention in some circumstances. And even when we do, the funny part is, and this goes along with that bandwidth problem, is that sometimes we know that information is in the back of our brain, but we cannot pull it to the front of our brain. And when we cannot do that, when we cannot apply it, what our brain does is that actually defaults to what we're actually the only things that it knows how to do or what to do. And we call that perseveration. We call that the broken record effect. So if you've ever seen someone trying over and over and over and over again for an IV when the patient's not breathing, they don't recognize that. They're just stuck in this rut trying to get an IV. Or someone's trying to place an airway and they're just moving the laryngoscope around inside the patient's brain, inside the patient's mouth, and exhibiting no changes to actually how they're managing that airway or troubleshooting. It's because their brain doesn't know what to do and they just default to this broken record, doing the same thing over and over again. And we know that multiple studies in multiple different venues demonstrate similar similar performance curves in the sense that we know that as stress and arousal goes up, we actually get a little bit of eustress. We're excited, our heart rate goes up, we get focused and energized and ready to do things. But at some point, if there's a little too much stress, we start to go down this hill. We start to feel anxiety, and our performance is actually impaired. And you can see that your hands start to shake. You lose fine motor control. You start to lose some of those mental faculties, forget facts and information or pieces or parts of a protocol. And all that is totally and completely normal, and it happens to the best of us. But here's the thing. Other research has shown that we can actually optimize the level of performance. We can extend that level of performance out so we can maintain that high level of performance, that high level of thinking at higher levels of stress. Well, how do you actually do that? Well, one of the ways that we actually see people being able to do it is something that we call deliberate practice. And it's important to note that deliberate practice may just seem like we're splitting hairs with the terminology, but it's important because it differentiates between just doing something over and over again and a focused, evidence-based way to get better at what you're doing. This is the way of the masters in sports, in hunting, in the military, in NASA, in aviation, in just about every high risk occupation or high stress occupation that we've studied. This is the way things seem to pay off. And that deliberate practice is characterized in with a number of features. So a deliberate practice, it has well-defined goals. So we're not just going in there to, okay, we got to check the box and intubate this mannequin so many times today. The goal might be, well, today what we're going to do is we're going to practice cricothyrotomy, and we're going to practice it in the setting of, I'm going to give you an airway and you're going to run through the different tools, maybe try an LMA or King or iGel, maybe try other maneuvers and they're not working, and then you're going to focus on the cricothyrotomy. It is focused and repetitive, so you're focusing on that skill multiple times, doing it again and again to get it right, wringing out all of the small mistakes and errors. Increased difficulty. So it's important to make it harder and harder. And that way, your brain and your mind and your technical abilities will adapt to increasing difficulty. Reliable quantitative feedback. So this is important. So a lot of the times we encourage people to videotape things so they actually see how long it takes them to do something. And that also gives them goals like how you can actually improve and get faster. This is actually really important because classically, when we look at both emergency physicians and paramedics, in various situations, especially when it comes to airway management, they seem to regularly be unable to accurately predict the time it takes them to do things. They might say, well, how long did it take you to put that endotracheal tube in? And they always seem to think that it's much faster than it actually is. And they don't even recognize sometimes evidence of hypoxia with patients. So it's important that you have that quantitative feedback as well as effective evaluation and qualitative feedback. So other peers, if you're an experienced paramedic or EMT, or supervisors, if you're a new person in orientation, giving you effective qualitative feedback on how you can reach those goals. How do you get better? Try this technique, try that technique, so on and so forth. And I think one great way to do this, the best way to do this in EMS is simulation. And it can be complex high fidelity simulation, or it can just be on the job, quick simulations using an iSimulate monitor or one of the other devices out there in a 15, 20, 30-minute mini simulation on every single shift. But it's important to understand how the simulation can help your organization and how that simulation actually achieved those goals of helping you achieve at that optimal performance at higher levels of stress. And here's pretty much how. Number one, simulation and deliberate practice change your brain. What we know is that your neurological tissue, the tissue in your brain, we used to think if you were born smart, you would be smart for your whole life and you would die smart. If you were good at math as a kid, you're good at math as an adult, and then you die good at math, and your brain essentially was fixed, right? And we know that that's not true. That is absolutely not true. People can learn, people can develop different parts of their brain, and what I always encourage people to think about is simulation is basically a workout for your brain. And we know that we can actually see that. We can study it. When we study it and we actually look at EEG tracing, so electrical tracings of the brain, and people that are first challenged with a really difficult scenario, what we see is it almost looks like they're having a seizure. The electrical activity is like the rapids in the Colorado River. It's all over the place. But as they train and as they go through the scenarios over and over again, it quiets down. The electrical activity in their brain becomes more fluid, especially in the areas that deal with executive function and organization and attention and focus. And that's a pretty amazing thing just to see it going through simulation and training, that the electrical activity in their brain actually gets more fluid and calmer. Likewise, what we can see in some studies is there's less output from the amygdala in the areas of the brain that deal with stress. So just by running people through these scenarios and teaching them and building their confidence and helping them get better, they seem to have areas of the brain that deal with stress that are less active. Furthermore, and what's cooler, there are some people who actually develop neuropeptides, or proteins and hormones in their brain that seem to damp down the signaling activity in the amygdala. So they actually, and the amygdala is the area of the brain that actually initiates some of those stress responses, like increases in adrenaline and actually increases in sympathetic tone that affect things like heart rate and whatnot. And what we see is that some people actually develop the ability to modulate or change the output from the amygdala. And that's pretty wild. So just by going through simulation and putting yourself in more difficult scenarios, your brain changes. Number two, there's good evidence that simulation helps clinical performance in and outside of the hospital. First, it seems to build your confidence. As you go through and we give you very difficult scenarios, even if you fail the first couple times or miss some stuff, if we keep on working at it and you get better and better, people report more or better confidence. And it's not that they have false confidence, but that confidence in their ability to overcome and learn and actually deal with difficult situations does seem to translate to the actual real clinical environment. You learn your limits and the boundaries of your skills. Hey, we're all adult learners here, right? We all know that there's some things we're good at and there's some things that we're not so good at. It happens for us as doctors too, all the time. And simulation gives you the opportunity, instead of when you have like a super sick dying patient in front of you, to, in a safer environment, actually identify some of those things and be like, man, actually, I forgot where that piece of equipment is, or I forgot to put how to put that thing together because we never ever use it. So it gives you opportunities to identify that stuff. It also consolidates information and concepts in your brain. When you have to recall information and apply it in a dynamic environment and see things or have information change in front of you and then make more decisions and think of more stuff, it actually consolidates that information in your brain and makes it easier to retrieve the next time. It is also the best practice for high-risk, low-frequency procedures, cricothyrotomy, and a handful of other procedures that are literally life and death things that we don't get to do that often. So simulation is a very good opportunity to practice that stuff. Also, it allows us to improve our processes. As adults in these organizations, we have to think about, well, how can we get faster? How can we get better at doing things? How can we better organize our equipment or have it more prepared to actually deploy on scene? All of these things, going through these pieces of equipment, going through these or using these pieces of equipment and how we actually have things set up in a simulation, allows us to troubleshoot those things as adults and peers and say, hey, maybe we should reorganize our first in bag, or hey, our airway roll really, wasn't very well set up. It's just a lot of there's just a lot of crap in there. I think we can get out. Okay, great. Simulation is a wonderful way to start those conversations about equipment and processes. Furthermore, and finally, there's pretty good evidence that it actually enhances crew resource management, safety, communication, and things on scene. And that's particularly important for us when we're working on the side of I-25 at 2 o'clock in the morning, or some rural road where somebody's rolled their ATV and it's dark and cold and windy, and we're still trying to communicate effectively with one another. So trying those things out in simulation seems to actually help in the real world. Now, finally, and this is sort of less along the lines of how it improves your performance and helps you deal with stress, but also important is it gives you data to make things better. This was one of those side effects that I realized both in the military and as a civilian, that you can actually use simulation to gather data to leverage making your system better. For example, if you have some old piece of crap equipment that it doesn't work very well or is ineffective, you use it in simulation and gather data over and over again. Hey man, this is not working. We've tried to use it 5 times in simulation, plus we had that call where things went bad. We need to replace this piece of equipment. Or gathering more specific information, like how we were telling you, like the batteries, we have a problem with the battery, or we have a problem with this piece of equipment or this particular part of the equipment. Well, we ran 6 simulations and it crapped out every single time, and right when we needed it the most. I think it's kind of unsafe, and I think we need to replace it. Or trying out in pieces of equipment that may not actually have to replace something that's broken or just not working, but may just be better. Like, hey, we ran the simulation with the entire teams, and throughout our trauma simulations, we gave them a bleeder on one arm and or both legs or something, and we used the tourniquets that we have, and everybody was like really difficult getting them out of the package, difficult putting them on. On average, it took people about 1 minute and 10 seconds to use our piece of equipment, but we tried this new cat tourniquet, and actually it was much more intuitive, much easier, and people were faster. They got it on in about 33 seconds. So on average, we were able to save 30 seconds by using this piece of equipment, and that is why I think that we should buy this piece of equipment or invest in it. And finally, it allows you to look at new pieces of technology and equipment, get used to using those new pieces of technology and equipment, and if there are still training shortfalls or educational shortfalls, go to the leadership and be like, you know what, I know we introduced this new video laryngoscope, people haven't used it very much, I think we need to take it to the OR or practice with it in an OR. I think we need to do a special entire simulation day or more training events that focus specifically on this piece of equipment. Or even, hey, I think we need to do a difficult airway course or some other type of special training to get up to speed to be able to use this piece of equipment. So those are some side benefits. Now, I always address people of significant experience, because I know as I got more and more experience, I ended up running more and more of the simulations. And when I was particularly crotchety about getting involved, I was like, I've been at this for a while. I need to train other people, but I'm not really going to participate in the simulation. And what I realized was I was actually a little bit scared of seeing my weaknesses exposed or screwing up. And then when I reflected on some of the most amazing leaders, both in medicine and the military, that I had to that were leading me, the most experienced people that I looked up to, they were never, ever afraid of throwing their hat in the ring and getting involved and actually participating in a simulation or participating in a particular military exercise and actually taking an active leadership role. And that, I think, was very important, because those experienced people were showing humility, the constant search and thirst for knowledge, always trying to get better. And I really looked up to that, and I realized, so what if I'm going to make mistakes? That's fine. I show other people that I'm human, and then show other people that there's some information in some of the protocols that I forget. Well, showing that vulnerability is a way of being humble and showing people that I'm human, and I think that it's actually a good leadership skill. So I think for even the most experienced paramedics and EMS personnel, you have to lead the way. And one of the ways you can lead the way is getting involved and actually participating in the simulation yourselves. So I think simulation can be very, very useful. I think it can be very important. I think what we have to do is we have to open up our minds, take on these opportunities as chances to develop our strengths and work on our weaknesses. I think that really it's important because we are dealing with life and death situations here, man. We are going to be out there in the field in some of the most difficult situations trying to rescue people and provide emergency care. And I think we owe it to ourselves to do everything we can to get better. I think we owe it to our colleagues to have our performance at its best and be on our A game, and most of all, we owe it to our patients. So thank you guys so much for your time, and get out there and simulate.